hotel booking confirmation. For two, under my husband's name. At a restaurant I've never been to, in a city we've never visited together. I found it on a Tuesday morning completely by accident. I was looking for the car insurance renewal in his email. He'd asked me to forward it to his phone, and there it was. The subject line said, "Reservation confirmed, Chez Laurent, Quebec City. Check-in date, our 38th wedding anniversary." I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. The coffee was getting cold. The dog was scratching at the back door. I didn't move. My husband's name was on the reservation. But the booking was for a table of two at a restaurant I'd never heard of, in a city we'd talked about visiting someday for 15 years, and never actually booked. And he hadn't said a word to me about it. Not one word. I want you to understand something about the man I married. For 38 years, Raymond has been the kind of husband who remembers to buy the right brand of crackers, who checks my tire pressure before long drives, who still holds the door. He is not a careless man. He does not make mistakes. So when I saw that email, my first thought wasn't suspicion. It was confusion. My second thought, the one that came about 3 minutes later, when I was still standing there with his laptop open on the counter, was something much worse. We'd had a difficult year. Not terrible, nothing dramatic, but the kind of quiet difficult that long marriages sometimes go through. Too many evenings in separate rooms. Too many conversations that stayed on the surface. Raymond had been distracted. Secretive, even, though I hadn't let myself use that word until right then. He'd been taking calls outside. Coming to bed after I was already asleep. Last month, I'd asked him if everything was all right, and he'd said, "Of course, why wouldn't it be?" In a way that made me feel foolish for asking. And now there was a reservation for two in Quebec City on our anniversary. And I wasn't the one he'd told. I closed the laptop. I poured the cold coffee down the drain. And I decided I needed to know. My daughter thought I was overreacting. She's 34 and very practical, and she said, "Mum, just ask him." She said this in the patient voice she uses when she thinks I'm being dramatic, which I found deeply irritating because I was not being dramatic. I was being a woman who had been married for 38 years and knew in her bones when something wasn't right. I didn't ask him. Instead, I called my friend Bet, who has been my closest friend since we were both young mothers pushing strollers along the same street in Kanata. Bet is the most sensible person I know, and also the only person I knew who would not immediately tell me to just talk to my husband. I told her about the email. She was quiet for a moment. "Quebec City," she said. "Payback City. And he hasn't mentioned it, not a syllable." She was quiet again. "Then, what do you want to do?" I said I didn't know. But that wasn't entirely true. There was an idea forming at the back of my mind, one I hadn't quite admitted to myself yet. It had started when Raymond mentioned at dinner the night before that his company's annual recognition dinner was coming up the following weekend in Gatineau. He said it with deliberate casualness, the way you say something when you're hoping it won't invite follow-up questions. "Spouses aren't usually invited to those," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "It's more of an internal thing." He'd said that exact same thing 3 years ago, about the same annual dinner, and at the time I hadn't thought twice about it. This time, I thought about it for the rest of the meal. "Bet," I said. "Do you still have that catering contact? The one you used for your granddaughter's christening?" Her name was Pauline. She ran a small catering company out of Gloucester, and she owed Bet a favor from a complicated situation involving a church fundraiser that I won't get into here. When Bet explained what I was thinking, Pauline was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, that's a new one." The hotel where Raymond's company was holding the dinner was a place called the Rideau Grand, a mid-sized conference hotel off the highway that was perfectly nice and completely anonymous. Pauline's company had done work there before. When she called to ask about supplemental staff for the evening, the event coordinator said yes without hesitation. It was a busy weekend. They needed people. I want to be clear about something. I am 62 years old. I have been a high school librarian for 30 years. I have never done anything like this in my life. When I put on the white shirt and dark trousers and clipped on the little name badge Pauline had given me, it said Ruth, which is not my name. My name is June. But Pauline said it was better to use something else. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror of the gas station where I'd gotten changed, and I genuinely could not believe what I was doing. But I thought about the email, and I went inside. The banquet room was large and already half full when I came through the service entrance. Round tables with white linens, centerpieces with those tall glass bases and floating candles, the kind of thing that looks elegant from a distance and slightly generic up close. A podium at the front. A bar along the left wall. I took a tray of water glasses from the kitchen pass and walked out onto the floor. Raymond was not hard to find. I have known that man for 41 years. We met 3 years before we married, and I could pick him out in a crowd of 1,000. He was standing near the bar with 2 colleagues I vaguely recognized from the Christmas party 2 years ago, laughing at something one of them had said. He was wearing his gray blazer, the one I'd taken to the dry cleaner last week without being asked. He looked comfortable, relaxed. He did not look like a man with something to hide. I refilled water glasses and tried to make sense of that. There were perhaps 60, 70 people in the room. The dinner was for a telecommunications company Raymond had worked at for 11 years. Project management. The kind of work that sounds boring when you try to explain it at parties, but that he genuinely loves. I set down glasses and collected empty ones and watched him from the edges of the room. He moved through the space easily, greeting people, stopping to talk. And then I saw her. She was standing near the stage area, talking to the event coordinator. Late 30s, maybe 40. Dark hair pulled back. A burgundy blazer. She was laughing at something, her hand moving as she talked, and as I watched, she turned and her eyes found Raymond across the room, and she smiled. He saw her. His face did something complicated. Not guilt exactly, more like anticipation, like someone who has been waiting for something and it is finally about to happen. My hands went cold. I set the tray down on the nearest surface and took a breath. My chest felt like something was sitting on it. I was 62 years old, standing in a hotel banquet room in a borrowed uniform, and I was watching my husband look at another woman across a room, and I did not know what I was seeing. I picked the tray back up. I kept moving. The dinner began. I worked the floor with the other servers, and I was grateful for it. Having something to do with my hands kept me from standing still long enough to catastrophize. I watched Raymond at his table. The woman in the burgundy blazer was at the table beside his. They were not sitting together. I held on to that. The speeches started after the main course. A man I didn't recognize, bald, enthusiastic, clearly the sort who enjoys a microphone, spoke about the company's year and thanked various departments. Raymond's team was mentioned. He ducked his head in that self-deprecating way he has when people say kind things about him. The woman in burgundy applauded and said something to the person beside her, and I was close enough to catch it. He deserves every bit of that. She said it with genuine warmth. The kind of warmth you reserve for someone you admire, someone you know well. I went back to the kitchen and stood by the dishwasher station for a minute. A young server named, I didn't catch his name, but he had a kind face, asked if I was all right. I said yes. He handed me a glass of water. I drank it. When I went back out, Raymond had moved. He was standing near the edge of the room, slightly apart from the crowd, looking at his phone. I moved toward him on instinct, carrying an empty tray, telling myself I just wanted to be closer in case what, I didn't know. His phone buzzed in his hand. He looked at it, then looked up and scanned the room. His eyes moved across me without stopping. I was wearing glasses. I don't usually wear. I'd switched to contacts years ago but kept a pair in the car, and my hair was pinned up under a clip that I never use. He looked right at me and saw a server. Nothing more. My husband of 38 years looked straight at me and did not know me. I don't know how to describe what that felt like exactly. There was something almost absurd about it, and underneath the absurdity, something sharper. He typed something on his phone and moved toward the corridor. I followed him. He went around the corner from the banquet room into a smaller hallway, past the coat check, and stopped near a window that looked out onto the parking lot. The overhead lighting was dim there. He was still looking at his phone. The woman in the burgundy blazer came around the corner 30 seconds later. I stopped moving. I was maybe 12 feet away, around a slight bend in the hallway. There was a service cart there that I positioned myself behind, heart going absolutely sideways. They stood together near the window. She said something I couldn't hear. He nodded. She pulled out a folder, an actual manila folder, and opened it on the windowsill. They both looked at whatever was inside. Documents. They were looking at documents. I strained to hear. I caught fragments, she doesn't know yet, and the timing has to be exactly right. And this one landed like a stone in still water. She's going to be so surprised. I stepped back. My shoulder hit the wall. She doesn't know yet. The timing has to be exactly right. She's going to be so surprised. I stood in that hallway and I thought about the email. Quebec City. Our anniversary. A restaurant I didn't know in a city we'd always meant to visit. I thought about the past year of distance and distraction and closed doors and phone calls taken outside. I thought about 38 years of crackers and tire pressure and held doors. And I was suddenly, horribly, not sure what I was thinking. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I fumbled for it with shaking hands. It was my daughter. The text said, "Mum, where are you?" I called the house. "Ray says you're at Bet's, but Bet just called me. What is going on?" And then, before I could do anything with that, Mom, he knows something is wrong. Just come home. I looked up. Raymond had turned back toward the banquet room. The woman in burgundy was tucking the folder back under her arm. I walked quickly to the service exit and got my coat from the hook by the kitchen door, and I left before anyone could see my face properly. I sat in the car in the parking lot for a long time. The drive home took 40 minutes. I did not listen to the radio. I went over everything I had seen and everything I had heard, and I tried to arrange it into a shape that made sense. And I couldn't. Not with any certainty. I had seen two colleagues standing in a hallway, looking at papers, saying things I'd only caught in pieces. I had made those pieces mean something terrible, and I didn't know if I was right. Raymond's car was in the driveway when I got home. The kitchen light was on. He was sitting at the table when I came in. He looked at me with an expression I recognized. It's the look he gets when he's genuinely worried. A slight tightness around his eyes that I've been reading for nearly 4 decades. He looked at what I was wearing. The white shirt. The dark trousers. The name badge still clipped to my pocket, which I had completely forgotten about. He said very quietly, "June." I said, "I can't explain." He said, "You were there." I said, "Yes." He put his face in his hands, not in the way someone does when they've been caught, in the way someone does when they are trying to decide how to begin. Then he looked up and said, "I've been planning this for 8 months." He'd started planning it the previous winter after a night in February when we'd had a quiet but honest conversation, one of the few real ones we'd managed that year, and I'd said, almost offhandedly, that I sometimes felt like we'd stopped making memories, that we were comfortable, but we'd stopped choosing each other on purpose. I barely remembered saying it. He had apparently not forgotten a single word. He'd been secretly saving, not from our joint account. He'd put aside a portion of his project bonus each quarter into a separate account he'd opened for exactly this purpose. He'd contacted a travel consultant. That was the woman in burgundy. Her name was Adrienne. She ran a boutique travel company in Ottawa that his colleague had recommended, and they had been planning, in careful secrecy, a trip I had wanted to take for 15 years. Quebec City in the spring, 10 days. A rented apartment in the old city, walking distance from everything. Dinners at restaurants he'd researched individually. A cooking class at a place that specialized in Quebecois cuisine. A day trip to Charlevoix. A private tour of the Citadel, because he remembered that I'd read a book about it once and mentioned it was somewhere I'd always wanted to go. The folder Adrienne had been showing him in the hallway was the final itinerary. She'd been attending the company dinner as a guest of another client, a coincidence he'd planned around, meeting her briefly to do a final review and collect the printed documents he'd wanted to have in hand rather than just saved on his phone. She's going to be so surprised. That was me. That was Adrienne talking about me. She doesn't know yet. Me again. The timing has to be exactly right, because he wanted to give it to me on the morning of our anniversary, wrapped with a ribbon, the way he proposed 38 years ago, with an envelope containing 2 train tickets to Montreal, and a handwritten note that said, "I'd like to see the world with you, if you'll let me." I sat across the table from him and I could not speak for a very long time. He was watching me with that worried look still in his eyes. He reached across and put his hand over mine and said, "I'm sorry it scared you. I thought I was being romantic. Apparently I was being suspicious." I laughed. It came out a bit strange because there were also tears somewhere in the vicinity, but it was real. "You looked right at me," I said. "You didn't recognize me." He frowned. "When?" "At the hotel. I was carrying a tray. You looked directly at me." He stared. Then, "That was you?" I was wearing glasses. My hair was up. He kept staring. Then he covered his face again, but this time his shoulders were shaking, and when he looked up he was laughing properly, the real laugh he has that uses his whole face. "June," he said. "I know," I said. "You dressed up as a waitress." "A server, Raymond?" "You dressed up as a server and came to spy on my work dinner. I prefer to call it an investigation." He laughed again. Then he stopped laughing and just looked at me, the way he used to when we were young, with the particular attention of someone who is choosing to look. "I haven't stopped noticing you," he said. "I should have told you that more." We sat at that kitchen table until nearly midnight. The dog fell asleep under my chair. The light above the stove buzzed faintly, the way it has for 6 years because neither of us ever remembers to replace the bulb. He told me all of it, every detail of the planning, every small decision. The restaurant in Quebec City was one he'd found in a travel article I'd left on the coffee table 3 years ago, a page I'd folded over and then forgotten about. He'd kept the magazine. He'd been keeping it in his office drawer. I thought about all the months I'd been feeling the distance between us and wondering if I'd imagined the marriage we used to have, and he had been sitting 10 feet away or 8 hours away at a worksite, quietly building me something to walk into. I called Bet the next morning. She answered on the first ring. "Well?" she said. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew it." I said, "You absolutely did not know it." She said, "I was 80% sure." I told her I was going to Quebec City in the spring, and she told me to bring her back something from a chocolatier she'd read about and that I absolutely owed her for the Pauline favor, and I said, "Yes, obviously." And we talked for an hour about nothing in particular, the way we have for 30 years. On our anniversary morning, I came downstairs to find an envelope on the kitchen table. Not a folder, not a printed itinerary. An envelope, slightly thick, sealed with the kind of deliberate care that means something. Inside was the itinerary. Yes, 10 pages, printed, annotated in his handwriting with little notes in the margins. "Good espresso here. You'll want to bring the wool scarf. The view from here at sunset, trust me." And beneath the itinerary, a handwritten card. He'd written, 38 years ago, I said I wanted to see the world with you. I still do. I always will. I'm sorry I went quiet for a while. I'm back now. So are we. He was standing in the kitchen doorway watching me read it, holding 2 cups of coffee. He had replaced the light bulb above the stove. I don't know when he'd found the time. I looked at him, this man I have known for 41 years, who looks right past me when I'm wearing the wrong glasses, who kept a dog-eared magazine page for 3 years, who spent 8 months building a surprise because I said one sentence in February that I'd already forgotten, and I thought, this is what choosing looks like. Not grand gestures every day, not perfect communication, just this, the quiet, patient, imperfect decision to keep showing up. We left for Quebec City on a Thursday morning in April. The drive from Ottawa took about 2 hours. The old city was just starting to get its spring color. Window boxes with early flowers, the stone walls bright in the morning light. Our apartment had a small balcony that looked out over a cobblestone street, and that first evening we sat on it with glasses of wine and didn't talk much, which was fine. Which was more than fine. There is a thing that happens in a long marriage, somewhere past the 30-year mark, that nobody really tells you about. The love changes its shape. It gets quieter. It stops announcing itself. And if you're not careful, if you let the busy years pile up without checking, you can start to mistake quiet for absence. It isn't absence. It's just different. I know that now. I probably knew it before, but I am glad I went to that hotel in my borrowed uniform and my old glasses and my name badge that said Ruth. I'm glad I stood in that hallway with my heart in my throat. I'm glad I drove home in the dark, not knowing what I was coming home to. Because when I walked through that door and found him at the kitchen table, already there, already waiting, already back, everything that had felt uncertain for months resolved itself into something clear. He chose me. Still. Again. In the oldest, most ordinary, most extraordinary way. And I chose him right back. I've thought a lot about what made me do it. Not the disguise. I understand the disguise, even if I'm slightly embarrassed about it still. I mean the thing underneath the disguise. The decision to act on a feeling instead of pushing it back down where it was easier to ignore. For most of my life, I would have pushed it down. I would have seen that email, felt the cold rush of it, and then talked myself out of the feeling by lunchtime. I would have told myself I was being ridiculous, that Raymond was a good man, that 38 years of evidence outweighed one confusing reservation, and I would have spent the next 6 months quietly hollowing out with something I never named properly. But I didn't do that, and I think there's something worth sitting with in that choice. Not because I was brave, because I wasn't, particularly. I was scared and I was acting from fear just as much as from courage, but I was at least honest with myself about the fear. I didn't dress it up as trust or patience or maturity. I said, something is wrong and I need to find out what it is. That honesty, just the small, unglamorous act of not lying to myself, is what set everything else in motion. What I found at the end of it wasn't what I expected. I expected confirmation or relief, one or the other. I didn't expect to find Raymond at the kitchen table with the light on, already waiting. I didn't expect to learn that the distance I'd been grieving for a year was him trying, quietly and imperfectly, to give me something I hadn't known he'd heard me ask for. That's the thing about the people we love over a long stretch of time. They are doing things we can't always see. The care doesn't always announce itself. Raymond kept a magazine page for 3 years. He opened a separate savings account. He met with a travel consultant in hotel hallways like he was doing something clandestine, because to him, because of what I'd said that February night, it was something sacred, and I almost undid all of it by assuming the worst. I'm not saying suspicion is always wrong. Sometimes it's right. Sometimes the fear is telling you something real, and you should listen. But I think there's a kind of wisdom that only comes from being willing to stay in the uncertainty long enough to find out which kind of fear you're dealing with. Not jumping to the worst conclusion, not performing calm, you don't feel either. Just staying present with what you don't yet know and trusting yourself to handle whatever the answer turns out to be. That's what I want to take from this, if I'm being honest. Not the romantic trip, as wonderful as it was. Not even the relief. It's the reminder that the people who have been with us the longest are still capable of surprising us, that a long marriage isn't a finished thing, that quiet is not the same as empty, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do, for yourself, for the person you love, for the truth between you, is to walk through the door and find out what's actually on the other side. Raymond replaced the light bulb above the stove. I don't know when he found the time, but when I came downstairs that anniversary morning and the kitchen was bright, properly bright, for the first time in 6 years I noticed, and I didn't say anything, and neither did he. We just stood there in the good light together, drinking our coffee. That was enough. That was everything.